This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books. As global crises deepen, social movements are striving toward new visions and experimenting with new strategies. From Palestine to the U.S. and beyond, radical politics have reemerged as necessary for both survival and full liberation. At this critical juncture, the Socialism Conference, August 30th through September 2nd in Chicago, will be a vital gathering place for today's left. Join thousands of activists and organizers to learn from each other in history, assess ongoing struggles, and experience the energy of in-person gatherings. Featured speakers at Socialism 2024 will include Arundhati Roy, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Noura Erakat, Mohammed El-Kurd, Ilan Pape, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Nick Estes, Vincent Bevins, Jules Gill-Peterson, Derica Purnell, me, Daniel Denver, Rachel Hertzing, Sarah Jaffe, Silky Shah, Ashley Dawson, and many, many more. The Socialism Conference is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Visit socialismconference.org to learn more and register today. Hope to see you there. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 15th episode of Thawra, the Dig's series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. We are nearing the very end of Thawra. This is the second of 3 episodes on the Palestinian Revolution, a trilogy that will bring our story of revolutionary, radical 20th century Arab politics to a close. Here, we pick up where we left off last time. The Palestinian Revolution establishing training camps, headquarters, bases, alongside social and political infrastructure in frontline states surrounding the Zionist settler state of Israel. Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Meanwhile, Palestinians in the pre-67 borders of Israel continued to struggle, often through the Israeli Communist Party Maki, and later through its anti-Zionist splinter party, Raqqa. But the Palestinian Revolution was concentrating its forces just outside the borders of historic Palestine, which, with the 1967 Arab military defeat, had been entirely conquered by the Israeli state. Jordan, with its massive Palestinian population and long border with Israel, was the Palestinian Revolution's first and logical headquarters. In Lebanon, the Palestinian Revolution liberated refugee camps from the brutal repression of the Lebanese government's Duksiem Bureau and secured the right to maintain an open guerrilla presence in the country. Syria, during the period when it was ruled by military Ba'athist Salah Jadid from 1966 through 1970, allowed training camps on its territory, but discouraged cross-border attacks from its soil. After the 1967 Arab defeat, and the subsequent huge prestige earned by the Palestinian Revolution in the wake of the 1968 Battle of Karama, the Palestinian Revolution won enormous freedom of action in these frontline states. But at the same time, the presence of an armed Palestinian movement, some of whose factions sought to overthrow reactionary Arab regimes alongside the Zionist state, created problems, including the problem of brutally disproportionate Israeli reprisals. It was this dynamic that led into Black September, the 1970 Jordanian monarchical assault on PLO guerrilla fighters. The violent expulsion of the PLO from Jordan that followed was hugely consequential, causing the Palestinian Revolution to relocate its headquarters to Lebanon. In Lebanon, The PLO then sought to build up its military presence and capacity in the country's south, within striking distance of the Zionist enemy. And it allied with domestic forces against right-wing Maronite Phalangist militias and against the entire sectarian colonial order. The PLO had to fight off and weather constant Israeli attacks, including an assassination campaign against cultural and political leaders. This dynamic in Lebanon would lead to civil wars and Israeli invasion, and ultimately to the 1982 Israeli siege of Beirut and to the PLO's subsequent evacuation. This marked the end of the Palestinian Revolution and the entire era of Arab revolution, a story that we will tell in the next episode. Meanwhile, Black September was also the precipitating event behind Hafez al-Assad launching a coup in Syria that ousted his one-time Ba'athist military ally Salah Jadid from power. Assad's coup in Syria, combined with the rise of Saddam Hussein in newly Ba'athist Iraq, spelled the end of Ba'athism's once emancipatory promise in both countries, and really across the entire Arab world. Making matters worse, the historic tribune of pan-Arab nationalism's revolutionary dream was sunsetting from the regional political scene. It was in September 1970 that Gamal Abdel Nasser died, precisely as he tried to negotiate an end to the fighting in Jordan. Nasser, as Thawra listeners know very well by now, was an unparalleled icon of Arab nationalism and Arab socialism, the leader of a region-wide struggle against Western imperialism and Zionism. In the mid-1950s, Nasser had been riding high after defeating the Western-aligned Baghdad military pact and holding off the tripartite aggression in Suez. It was a series of victories that culminated in the formation of the United Arab Republic in 1958, but Syria's secession in 1961, and then the catastrophic Arab loss to Israel in 1967, had attenuated Nasser's power. After Nasser's death, Anwar Sadat took control in Egypt. Sadat would go on to definitively end the country's vanguard role in Arab revolution and instead make Egypt a leading architect of a new accommodation with reaction and imperialist power. Nevertheless, conflict between Israel and Arab states persisted and then exploded again when Sadat's Egypt and Assad's Syria launched the surprise October War of 1973. It was not an overwhelming Arab victory, but Egypt and Syria's battlefield successes in the face of massive U.S. arms shipments to Israel dented the Zionist settler state's aura of military invincibility and redeemed, in part, a sequence of Arab military failures stretching back to 1948. At the same time, an oil embargo against the U.S. and other countries backing Israel, launched by Arab states, made the use of the oil weapon in anti-imperialist geopolitics newly thinkable. But the Arab world would not collectively achieve any real benefit from these victories. These tactical and martial achievements came precisely when the power of left-wing and anti-imperialist politics was declining across the region, at least within the commanding heights of state power. The United States, with Henry Kissinger at the lead under Presidents Nixon and Ford, exploited the opening and embarked on a diplomatic strategy of disuniting Arab countries from one another, and also, simultaneously and very much relatedly, from the Palestinian cause. That approach fit perfectly with Sadat's goal of ending the Arab Revolution to make peace with the American empire and with Israel in exchange for the latter returning the Sinai Peninsula. A traitorous peace that was made in 1977 and 1978, and which we will discuss in our next episode. We end this episode by assessing the nature and causes of the U.S. relationship with Israel, a fraught, controversial, and extremely important question. Before we get this episode rolling, we are so close to the end of this series, and I just want to ask you to join other listeners in supporting the podcast at patreon.com/thedig. One more episode of Thawra left, and then an epilogue. It's been a huge project, very much unlike anything we've ever done, and we're doing it because it is precisely the mystification and erasure of this history of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary politics that is a substantial part of the edifice upon which the legitimacy of contemporary Western imperialism and Zionism has been constructed. This is a political education project, and we make it free for all, regardless of your ability to pay. That is an absolute priority for us, and it's only possible because those of you who want to contribute and can afford to contribute do so at patreon.com/thedig. All contributors receive our excellent newsletter by email. And depending on where you live and how much you contribute, we have gifts to send you in the mail, including tote bags, coffee mugs, books, and we are working on a Thawra poster. Anyhow, contribute now if you can afford to support us and you appreciate what we do. Many of you are like, ooh, maybe I'll do it next week. I get it, but please just do it now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Finally, if you're in London on July 26th, come see me and Eleanor Penny interviewing Jeremy Corbyn and Lala Khalili on the politics of left-wing internationalism. That following a live recording of the Macrodose podcast with James Meadway, Theorio Francos, Dalia Gabriel, and Asad Rahman. Tickets are going fast. Buy them now. There's a link in the show notes. Okay, here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University, a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. And that website, I'm pleased to report, is back up and running. There are a few kinks to work out, a few broken links to fix, but the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website is up and running. There's a link in the show notes. Please check it out. The Palestinian Revolution required bases and a headquarters outside of historic Palestine. And for those things, they looked to frontline states bordering the Israeli Zionist settler state, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. What in the period leading up to Black September in 1970 did the Palestinian Revolution's relationship with and presence in each of these countries look like?
Yeah, so if we tie this actually to the question of political architecture in the PLO, we see that Arafat understood when he was constructing it that you need to account for regional interventions in the Palestinian arena, as we mentioned. And the regional dimension is important because the Palestinians are a refugee people. And internal action within Palestine was now repressed. So, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, the attempts to launch a revolution in the West Bank, for example, had been suppressed and nipped in the bud early on the part of the Israelis. So what was known as the second intilaqa, the second launch, was aborted. The attempts of other Palestinian formations to create also armed action were nipped in the bud. So you had, therefore, a need to intervene in the broader regional arena and to ensure that there would be Palestinian freedom of work in the broader regional arena, especially in the states that had borders with the Israeli settler colonial state. So, and that meant Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Notice that I omitted Egypt because what tended to happen, and this is fairly typical in these situations, is that strong states that are still fully in control over their internal boundaries will not allow you to operate unless they want you to operate within their borders. And in general, most strong states in the region did not want their borders to be theaters of operations for Palestinian Fidaiyin. That's because they prioritize national security needs, but also it's because they had very big calculations relating to this broader global geostrategic arena. Additionally, in the case of Egypt, of course, they had no control over Sinai, which meant that there were no suitable places to establish Fidai groups, even if the Egyptian state, which is a strong state internally, it has full control over its internal arena, or a great deal of control over its internal arena. It was not going to allow that. So the Palestinian Revolution then had to deal with three options, and it operated in these three arenas: Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Most of the focus in the period 1967 to 1970 was, of course, on Jordan. That's natural because Jordan has a majority Palestinian population, and the East Banker population, who are what you would call Jordanians, okay? They're sympathetic, very sympathetic. They're culturally, politically, and socially extremely intertwined with Palestine and the Palestinian people, and not in the ways that the Zionists describe it as an alternative homeland. We spoke about this a million times, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate it. The idea of liberating Palestine is essential there. So you had a popular atmosphere that was conducive to starting operations there. Jordan also had lost the West Bank. Remember, it had annexed it. So in technical terms, there was another incentive. Politically, this was a country that had lost territory. So it would have been difficult for the government there to come and confront this project of regaining the land through organizing armed revolutionary struggle without clashing with the will of broad popular sections. Eventually, of course, the monarchical government did find a way to mobilize social forces against the revolution, but we'll get to that in a second. Lebanon was a more complicated arena because Lebanon was such a deeply divided society by design. Politically, it was divided by design. The French had designed it as such. Even in the Ottoman period, there was that process started, and for people who want to understand how that worked, I think we might have referenced this book before, but Osama Maqdisi's Culture of Sectarianism is a very good place to start. In the 19th century, you have all sorts of social conflicts, but also colonial interventions that intersect to produce a culture of sectarianism. So you have sectarianism in this space. And by that, we mean that there are active political forces that operate in accordance with declared, logic that serves particular sects. And sometimes in political science, they refer to this as consociationalism, and they're trying to put a positive spin on it. But what it does really is that there's clusters, and they're centered around leaderships within specific religious communities. In the French tradition around Lebanon colonially, they had set up the whole system, and we talked about this before, in a way that privileged Maronite Christians and many ways disenfranchised Shiite citizens from the south. But also there were other religious minorities that felt that they didn't have their fair share of the political pie, or that and there were others, particularly those belonging to the left, that rejected the logic of the system as a whole, to its core. If you're a communist, you're not going to be a fan of the idea of organizing your political life based on sect. This is insanity. Even if you're a basic liberal, this is insanity. Because you'd be thinking, well, we're all citizens. Why? What is this thing about, like, I'm a Maronite Christian and you're an Orthodox Christian and the other person is a Shia Muslim and then there's a Sunni Muslim. There are 18 major sects and many more out there. So these forces that were disgruntled with the system, either because they did not have enough representation in it or because they rejected the logic of it, which are the leftist forces, of course, the secular left, they tended to be sympathetic to the idea of a Palestinian armed presence in Lebanon. And there was also another factor which was important, which is that in many of those circles anyways, there was a strong anti-colonial ideology in operation and an ideology that emphasized the injustice that was afflicting the Palestinian people. Remember, Lebanon absorbed Palestinian refugees, many, and people saw their misery. They knew about Israeli practices early on, but also they witnessed them firsthand. And that left a deep impact, especially in the south of the country, but also elsewhere. And many in Lebanon who had either a pan-Arabist ideology or different Islamic ideologies or leftist ideologies were aligned with the idea of Palestinian liberation. And the reason why I mentioned this is that in today's discussions in Lebanon, many people say, well, the Palestinians showed up and they entered the country, entered into chaos and so on. Well, actually, Lebanon had just come out of its own internal civil war that we described in an earlier episode, okay, and which had witnessed the first and most major American military intervention and landing, okay, and the political outcome was not decisive yet. So Palestinians were entering into an already charged political arena, but also into a political arena in which competing ideologies were in existence.
This is 1958 when U.S. Marines land in Lebanon, just to orient listeners.
Yes, just to remind our listeners, yes. And now, a few years later, like literally 9 years later, we have 67. So you have the student movement, by the way, going down in all the universities, and especially American University and others. They're going down to the streets chanting for Al-Asifa, for Fatah, and for other formations that were active. You had branches of the movement of Arab nationalists chanting for the PFLP and the new formations that were coming out of that. You had the Baathists that were supporting this. And then you have also traditional leaders like Kamal Jumblat that were promoting modern ideologies. He had developed a party called the Progressive Socialist Party. He was embracing ideas of socialism and so on, which is, even though he comes from a feudal or semi-feudal background, but, he was promoting these ideas and he was talking about an anti-sectarian program. He was trying to develop that. So somebody like him, and again, we don't have the time to go into the motivations of each actor. But the point is that you had this popular trend that was pushing for Fidai action. And this is, by the way, not to mention the strong connection that had existed in places like the South, where the peasantry and the working class allied themselves with the idea of Palestinian liberation for many reasons. That include historic connections, but also contemporary possibilities that were opened by these movements. So Palestinians started to operate in that space. Now, they were operating under actually a legitimate formula that came about as a result of a Lebanese internal political crisis. And that was called the Cairo Agreement, which were signed in 1969, because up until that point, between 67 and 69, you had this tension between the Lebanese army, which was trying to crack down on Palestinian guerrilla action, and of course, the Palestinian movements. And that produced then a constant set of crises. Eventually, a working formula was arrived at in negotiations that were sponsored by Gamal Abdel Nasser. This essentially legitimated the idea of the Lebanese space being used and Lebanese territory being used for developing guerrilla activities. Okay, so many years later, of course, that produced all sorts of resentments in Lebanon. Okay, especially from the very beginning, the right in Lebanon, and especially the ones that saw themselves as allied to the Kata'ib party, one of the largest Maronite parties. But essentially, any sphere, any of the movements operating in the Maronite sphere outside of the left did not like this arrangement, because they had their own aspirations for Lebanon that were based on notions of keeping the old formula of Maronite supremacy. But also because ideologically, there was this promotion of the idea that they had a separate identity, a Phoenician one, not an Arab one. So there was no sense of connection. They were like, what do we have to do with Palestine? We're Phoenicians and they're Arabs, which of course is absolutely ridiculous, because Phoenicians are Canaanite peoples that operated across the Syrian coast from the very north to the very, it's a long story, but as you know, all of these ideas are manufactured, and invented, and they serve political agendas in the present. So that's the structural situation that produces so much of the dynamics that we were to see later on as the years passed by, and that was to lead to a major, or to contribute at least in major ways to the eruption of a civil war in Lebanon.
So we've covered Jordan and Lebanon. Let's get into Syria. What was the relationship like between the PLO and this Ba'athist government of Salah Jadid, which took power in 1966 and, as we'll get to soon, lost power in 1970?
So in Syria, there was this interesting situation. Of course, for Fatah, it was operating in Syria already, okay? And for a while, there was a fear that its operations would be disrupted after 1967 and everything that took place. But of course, there were forces internal to the political context in Syria and internal to the regime that were pro increased Fida'i action, increased commando action, although they did not prefer that it get carried out from Syrian territory. The preference was to support it in the Lebanese front and Jordanian front more. There were some operations that took place from Syria, but that was not the primary arena. However, Syria allowed for bases to continue to function, and in fact there was an expansion of bases that were functioning out of Syria. There was one major training center that was initially established for Fatah and another for Movement of Arab Nationalists. For the PFLP now, it was renamed, of course. And then later on, there was an expansion of all of that. A great deal of training was going on in Syria. So Syria became one of the main places where you would go before you volunteer to fight on the front, and you would receive training. That has a long history. I mean, the original training for Fatah, for example, everybody who's gone through Fatah's early phase and had been a fighter in it will tell you that they either went to the Shirsal military academy in Algeria, or they trained at the Al-Hame base in Syria, and they received there some equipment and then went on to Jordan or to Lebanon to do their actual service in the revolution. So that was one of the main functions. It was also a place where headquarters were located. It was a place where a lot of the logistics were taking place. Notice in this period, by the way, the movement across borders between these states was fairly smooth. A lot of Fida'is could move much more easily. And before 1967, there was such restriction on movement. But now, again, because of the war, these armies had taken a big hit. The security services had taken a big hit. The prestige of the Fida'is had gone really up. So there was now a greater ability to move people, to move weapons, to move equipment and this mobility contributed to the ability to undertake operations. The Israelis were constantly, of course, bombing targets in these different places, including in Syria, where they bombed Tartus training center, which was a major training center for Fatah, for example. So we should always bear in mind that this period was not one in which the states in the region could offer this kind of access for the Palestinian Revolution without facing repercussions. In fact, the Israeli doctrine throughout was what you would call like a raging bull kind of approach, like just destroy everything if you get like hit by anything. Yeah. So in any case, the Syrians had certain regional pressures on them to continue supporting, but also they had their own internal ideological alignments that geared and it encouraged them to continue to support. And let's not forget, at this stage, the government there was proclaiming that it's a left-wing government. The civilians in the government had served in the FLN, a lot of them. I think we might have referred to this earlier. These were doctors that served in the FLN. They had been in the Algerian struggle, and talking about Nuruddin al-Attasi and these people, Ibrahim Machos and these people, they were very allied with the Palestinian effort in many ways. Ideologically, I'm talking. They were not opposed to it. But also, you had, a Syrian military that saw the importance of this for morale and for other reasons relating to the Syrian front. And remember, Syria had lost territory, Golan Heights, at this stage. So it felt there was a popular feeling that again was very much pro-Fida'is, pro-Palestinian mobilization.
I want to shift briefly back into the 48 territories, the initial territories occupied by Zionist forces in 1948 that becomes the State of Israel. In the wake of the Nakba, only about 150,000 Palestinians remained inside the formal territory of the State of Israel after 48. And we've talked in a prior episode about the Israeli Communist Party, or Maki, a party with substantially Jewish leadership, but a heavily Arab base, and the role that it played in these first decades of the State of Israel in articulating Palestinian demands. But in 1965, a new, mostly Palestinian, Arab-led communist group called Raqqa broke off from the mostly Jewish-led Maki, adopting a clearly anti-Zionist position and also, I think, more firmly aligning itself with the Soviet Union. And just as an aside, today, so as not to confuse listeners who follow contemporary Israeli politics, the split off Raqqa is now called Maki again because the old party Maki dissolved itself into a different formation called Ratz, which then dissolved itself into the left Zionist party Meretz. But anyhow, returning to the 1960s, there's Raqqa splitting off from Maki, and there's also more revolutionary socialist and anti-Zionist currents like the group Matzpen. What did Palestinian and Jewish New Left radicalism look like inside the State of Israel? And to what extent did it create any sort of possibility for any sort of substantial, meaningful, consequential Jewish Arab anti-Zionist politics within the 48 borders?
So all of the events that you've described, Daniel, have to be contextualized with reference to the composition of the Israeli Communist Party, which was originally referred to as Maki, and then had witnessed the Raqqa split that you referred to in 1965. What had happened after the Nakba was that the party's base increasingly became, of course, Arabized, and its presence amongst Arab ranks, Palestinian Arab ranks, grew exponentially, because of course, unlike the pre-Nakba period, when it was operating in a political environment where there were many movements, and which was a small ideological party that had contend with much larger parties operating in the Palestinian arena and drawing on large patrician families and networks and kinship arrangements and different dynamics altogether. The Communist Party after 1948 was one that was the only space that was officially allowed to operate that Arabs could join. Palestinian Arabs could join. The Zionist parties did not want Palestinian Arab members in them and did not offer them a space that they could live with, at least. Later on, of course, they started competing over their votes, but to be represented in the party and to have an agenda that serves you was not something that was going to be given to you by the Labour Party, for example. Okay. They were not interested in an Arab base. They were explicitly Jewish-oriented parties. The communists, on the other hand, opened their doors for that. And they had reunited, of course, the Arab and the Palestinian Arab and Jewish members of the party after the Nakba had undergone a process of reunification. And you had major political figures in the Arab society in 1948 emerging out of this process. So the leaders politically of the Palestinian Arab community that remained after the Nakba were predominantly communists. You had people like the great writer Emil Habibi, for example, and I encourage our listeners to purchase his novella, The Peace Optimist, which is a great, wonderful novel about the conditions of Palestine in 1948. You had Emil Touma, you had Tawfiq Zayyad, the great poet, and was mayor of Nazareth. All these figures, they came out of the Communist Party. And by the way, there's an excellent study of this that was written by my colleague and friend Maha Nassar, who teaches in Arizona. She wrote a book called Brothers Apart, so I recommend that. In any case, we're entering a new arena in the mid-60s when you have elements that were Zionists within the communist movement that are saying that they have a problem with the Soviet Union's increasing hostility to the Israeli state. Remember, regionally, there had been a reconstitution of the geopolitics of the region. Increasingly, the Soviet Union became more aligned with Egypt and other Arab countries, and the Israelis became more aligned with the West. So that produced a complicated environment within the party, and you had people that represented an what was referred to by many people as an anti-Soviet line, which was really a Zionist line. It was led by Moshe Sneh, and it was promoting ideas that the Communist Party should have a Zionist orientation. How are you going to sell that to a party whose majority members were Palestinian Arabs? The vast majority. It was electoral base as that. So that produced a problem. Now, what ended up happening is that essentially the Palestinian Arab leaders plus Jewish leaders that were pro-Soviet and anti-Zionist, like Mayor Vilner, they decided to form their own thing as a result of this. And they essentially created a new formation called Raqqa that represented an anti-Zionist line. Now, it's not clear to me that this anti-Zionist line would have had a chance with Jewish descendants of settler colonists or new settler colonists. And that was basically the audience that some of the Zionist communists were clearly targeting. But it was obvious that the main program of the party was going to draw on the energies of Palestinian Arabs within the state. And eventually what ended up happening was the Zionist communists disappear from the map anyways. I mean, it's not a sustainable ideology, and it does not have a popular base. And that gets proven in elections immediately after the split happens. They pretty much lose the original Maki representation in the Israeli Knesset dwindles significantly, while the Raqqa one takes over essentially. They win many more seats. They win like 3 seats, and those guys win only 1. So, and barely, but Palestinian resistance internally, though, cannot be just understood with reference to these dynamics. The Communist Party is a very important space for Palestinian resistance at this stage because it's the only functioning that could be allowed by the state to function. But you had also other formations. I think we've referred to them in previous episodes. There was Harakat al-Ard that developed the land movement that developed early on. There was other movements that developed like Abna al-Balad. And of course, remember, Daniel, all of these movements had to operate initially in conditions that were totally horrific. I mean, up until 1966, martial law was in operation across the Palestinian communities that were occupied in 1948. And this meant that even for communists, let's say, in the Communist Party, you'd have communist Jews enjoyed more privileges than Palestinian communists. They were under martial law. They were in situations that were absolutely controlled. You could not organize openly in that atmosphere without risking arrest, humiliation, reprisals against your family. And I'm emphasizing this because in many occasions and in many circumstances, people forget the deep struggles that were carried out by Palestinians in 1948. Another form of struggle in Palestinians that was waged by them, by the way, was to support the Palestinian Revolution that we have been consistently referring to across this episode, because it needed logistics, it needed people who know the situation inside, and throughout the period of Palestinian armed struggle, there were always people from 1948 areas that were joining it, because they saw themselves as part of the Palestinian people, even though there was this attempt to split them apart from that people and isolate them. A good story about this, for example, Therese Halase. She was somebody who left Haifa, walked on foot with her friend. She had just graduated from high school, and she was like, I want to join the Fidaiyin in this period. When I asked her once, I interviewed her before she passed away. I mean, she's now passed away. What were the influences that influenced you? And she's like, well, I grew up in a house where I used to listen to Nasser's speeches, which was, of course, illegal. But also, when the 67 war happened and I saw what was going on, I wanted to respond to that, and I wanted to fight against this state that was oppressing me. Now, that's on the Palestinian end. Back to the communist dramas in the Israeli state. Okay, so you have another split that you kind of hinted at, which is a split between Maki and folks that had issues with just complete support for Soviet policy without any critical assessment. And this coincided also with what they saw as a more principled stance against Zionism. So, we were referred to one side of the party that considered that the party was too anti-Zionist. Now we're looking at another side of the party that was saying it's not anti-Zionist enough. In particular, these include people like Moshe Makover and, of course, Akiva Or. These people saw themselves as more critical. They could be seen as more impacted by some new left ideas. They even had different affiliations with the Palestinian figures as well that saw themselves as being part of this new wave. People like Jabra Nicola, others like that. But you had the development of new debates in the 1960s that would have been difficult to have in the Zionist state in the 1950s. There was this early fervor after the Nakba of Zionist fervor that narrowed down space. That's why the Communist Party, for all its ills in that moment, and some of its ills now are referred to by nationalists amongst Palestinian citizens of Israel circles, because later on there's of course an additional split that happens amongst the Communist Party that produces a new party in the Arab scene. In 96 you have the Azmi Bshara and a group of people from the Israeli Communist Party. They start the Tajammu', the gathering. They sometimes say, well, the Communist Party made us raise Israeli flags during Independence Day in the 50s, and they did it. They criticize it for not according Palestinians a space for expression of national sentiment, and that's true. But of course, the context of the 50s was so repressive. By the 60s, we can have conversations around these questions that expand a bit more, and there was a possibility for reevaluations of a bunch of issues, including the relationship with the Soviet Union, the relationship with Zionism, and so on and so forth.
In September 1970, the PLO became engulfed in a giant armed conflict with King Hussein of Jordan. It was an event infamously known as Black September, when Jordanian forces surrounded and launched major attacks on PLO forces across the country. And there's a lot to unpack here, and we have to do so rather expeditiously because we have a ton of ground to cover. First, the basics. What led the Jordanian state to attack PLO forces? And then what did that conflict reveal about these larger contradictory dynamics that had emerged in these complex, fraught relationships between the PLO and frontline states like Jordan from which the PLO operated? And then second, what role did countries like Iraq and Syria, both of which at least claim to back the Fedayeen, what role did they play in Black September? Because Syria's actions, as we'll get into soon, they would have a major impact on Syrian domestic politics. It's really a key event in terms of understanding how Assad came to power there, but we'll get to that in a few moments.
All right, so it's good to think about this in terms of the actual existing historiography, which starts, in my view, from the wrong premise. They start by accepting, actually, the dominant version offered by the existing Arab states, who assert that the problem had to do with state sovereignty. And of course, from a state perspective, that's totally fine. If you start from the premise that the foremost value and ultimate principle in this world is state sovereignty, then you will see the Palestinian Revolution as engaging in something illegitimate. Now, at the same time, the existing historiography contradicts itself, because their standard of what is right and wrong is state sovereignty, but then they apply this set of tricks when it comes to analyzing events, where they focus on transgressions on the part of the revolution, and particularly in Jordan, this is a big deal. It becomes like, what are the mistakes that led to a clash between the state and the revolution? Unfortunately, due to the defeat that happened in Jordan and all the defeats that happened to the Palestinian Revolution afterwards, their internal Palestinian discussions go down that route as well. They start from this idea that there were transgressions, mistakes, and in a way that assumes that the situation could have been structurally significantly different had there not been these mistakes. I think that's an oversimplification of reality. I think that we should think of this as a core structural contradiction between the logic of the state and the logic of the monarchy, okay, and the logic of revolution. They're incompatible. Okay, the revolutionary forces wanted to establish Jordan, and in this case, by the way, they were backed by a vast swath of people, of popular movements and individuals across the country that were keen to initiate armed struggle against the Israeli settler colonial state. So Their logic was to establish Jordan as a base for a revolution. That could not at any moment be compatible structurally with the logic of the regime. Now, the regime, however, had two directions within it. One was playing a waiting game and was willing to strike some temporary deals with the revolutionary forces, and the other wanted to strike quickly and to nip this process in the bud. So, in a way, the events that took place in Jordan between the defeat of 1967 and Black September, showed elements of that contradiction. But that was not a struggle over the principle, which is that there should not be independent revolutionary action emanating from that country. That any action should be actually controlled by the state, and preferably, as far as the state is concerned and the monarch is concerned, there should be no action. Okay. Now, the monarch at the same time could not declare that, and the state could not declare that, because that would have resulted in a serious popular uprising potentially. So this is the structural kind of dimension that we need to focus on. Now, you had elements within the Jordanian state, however, that were not connected to the monarchy, that were keen on supporting Fida'i work and initiating revolutionary work. These included patriotic officers in the Jordanian army, and some very senior ones at that. Mashhur Hadith al-Jazi, for example, is a good example of that. He is the leader of the forces that initiated the Jordanian artillery attack on the invading Israeli army during the Battle of Karame. And he later becomes the head of the Jordanian army as a whole. He's someone that considered that there should be a very strong relationship between the army and the Fida'iyin, and that the army should back Fida'i action and revolutionary action. However, there were others in the Jordanian regime that were opposed to that, and amongst the leading voices in that tradition is, of course, the king's uncle, Sharif Nasser, who was advocating complete destruction of the Fida'iyin. Within Fida'i circles also there were divisions, and that did not help the situation in Jordan. You could not have a formula that was unified even under the PLO, and that's because the two movements that came out of the movement of Arab nationalists, the two major organizations that came out of it, had a different perspective on what to do with the Jordanian regime than their competing historic rival, which was Fatah. Fatah's overall approach to Arab regimes was that there should be Palestinian non-interference with them as far as possible. So they did not have a theory of taking over the state in any Arab country. That was not their position. Their position, however, was that Arab countries should allow for Palestinian action against the Israeli state. For the PFLP and DFLP, the outlook was different. As we know from our previous discussions of the movement of Arab nationalists, their view was that there needed to be a revolution in the surrounding Arab states, an overthrow of reactionary Arab regimes, so as to be able to carry out a popular liberation war. And this was definitely the position that was advocated by the DFLP in relation to Jordan. They were calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. And Naif Hawatmi, who comes from Jordan, by the way, was very strongly calling for that. He was, of course, the head of the Democratic Popular Front that we spoke about. And his rival within the movement of Arab nationalists, George Habash, who was of course, the traditional leader and who became the head of the PFLP, he had to kind of also go along with that position. Now, initially, he was hesitant about advocating for that openly, although most of his cadres would have believed in that. But by May Day 1970, he advocates for that openly in a speech during May Day, which of course in all over the world except the US is celebrated as Labor Day. So in his address to Jordanian Palestinian workers and Arab workers, he called for the overthrow of the monarchy. So this situation meant that you have two directions within the Palestinian Revolution itself, in relation to the regime, and also two directions within the regime in relation to the revolution. Structurally, though, there was a contradiction between revolution and the state. And that contradiction was seen over and over again. There were clashes between the Popular Front, for example, and elements of the Jordanian army in 1968, as early as that. There were clashes that could have taken place even between Fatah forces and the army in earlier periods. There were incidents that the Fidaiyin insist were orchestrated by the Mukhabarat and the state. For example, there was a group under somebody called Tahir Dablan, which had sketchy aims and seemed to be attacking Jordanian military targets. And most Fida'is believe that it was, orchestrated by the Jordanian intelligence services. The Jordanian intelligence services, by the way, they included even Palestinian elements. So one of their leading strategists in relation to the Fida'i groups was a man who came from Nablus. He essentially advocated a position that called for finding a formula that would infiltrate these movements. So he encouraged splits and infiltrations because he knew a lot about them. So this meant that you had a series of clashes. Now, what you also had was a situation, and this is where the autocritique of the Palestinian movements is reasonable. You did have also a situation where a lot of these parties and movements were unable to fully control the overall direction of events. Because this was a situation where the state was weak and where thousands and thousands of people suddenly joined the revolution. They did not go through the normal track of training and ideological preparation and induction. And that meant that also some of them were not disciplined. So if you have like a young teenage person being given a gun, they could do stupid stuff with it. And there are many stories that came out of Jordan in that period of people harassing police officers unnecessarily. They have resentments towards them from previous years, of course. They have resentments towards all symbols of the state, but they were not strategic in terms of distinguishing between the state and the police officers and the soldiers, which led then to growing resentment. And this is an important theme in Palestinian analyses of Black September and also in Jordanian patriotic analyses of Black September, because they're posing the question of how was the monarchy able to generate popular support for the crackdown on the revolution at a time when just a couple of years earlier there was massive support for the revolution. So incidents like that created a sense of alienation that could be used by the regime, and some of them, again, were manufactured. Others took place because of lack of discipline, quick expansion, and without enough vetting. Now, the outcome was, by 1970, you have the king preparing for a big crackdown. And there is essentially an American shipment of weapons that he receives. He carries out a big conference for Jordanian tribal leaderships from the East Bank to basically call for loyalty to the king and mobilization against this phenomenon. And here he uses basically Jordanian local nationalism to achieve his mobilizational aims. So traditionally, the regime in Jordan tried to promote its own conservative version of Arab nationalism, under monarchical Hashemite banner. But now it needed to rebrand itself as a representative of the local Jordanian identity. And of course, this is a mixed space ethnically. It's like at least split half and half, if not majority Palestinian. But you have, of course, Jordanian tribes and families that are rooted in the country, and the Jordanian regime could rely on them. The advantage is they constitute the majority of the senior ranks in the army, and also of the rank and file. And with enough purging, you could create a military that could crack down on the revolution with that. This is structurally the situation that happens. There's a deep mobilization going on. There's an arming, and then they use the excuse of plane hijackings and some of the strategies that were deployed by the PFLP to say, okay, sovereignty is lost in this place. There's no respect for the state. There's no respect for the army. It's disorder and chaos. Okay, we have to crack down. So that's the popular logic that is promoted by the regime at this stage. And it carries out a big crackdown on the entire Fida'i presence in September 1970.
And then what does the actual crackdown look like, and what role do other Arab states, particularly those that ostensibly are strong supporters of the Fida'i, play, particularly Syria?
So there's two Arab states that have an immediate military bearing on the situation in Jordan in this period, which are Iraq and Syria. Iraq has a military contingent in Jordan, and in many ways the king was delaying action against the Fida'iyin because since 1967 that Iraqi troop deployment was there to help Jordan, of course, not be invaded by the Israeli forces that had taken over the West Bank and could potentially threaten the rest of the country. But the worry was that detachment, that Iraqi deployment could be used to support the Fida'iyin. And here you had special talks between the king and the Iraqi army that helped ensure that the person in charge in Jordan would not intervene in favor of the Fida'iyin. Now, that was a miscalculation on the part of the Fida'iyin as well, including the PLO leadership thought that the Jordanian state will have to really consider its options because of the presence of this Iraqi unit. It might not crack down.
And this is an Iraqi unit that is ostensibly following orders of the now Ba'athist regime in Baghdad.
Yes, although it's a complicated story. I mean, the head of the detachment, of course, is related to Saddam Hussein. So you have a relative of Saddam's leading it. But during Black September, you have a situation where there are suspicions that it might have been a direct deal with King Hussein. So these are, it's a complicated discussion whether it was authorized by the leadership in Baghdad or not. But most likely, they would have had knowledge of it, but we can't. And of course, the situation in the case of the Syrians was much more serious, because in Syria you had a government that claimed to be very leftist, that claimed to be very Fida'i, and that was committed to promoting a revolution, at least on the surface. When the attacks on the Fida'is happened in 1970, they were pressuring for an entry to Jordan, and they did. But the Syrian troops were not given air cover by a member of the Syrian leadership that controlled the Air Force, which is, of course, Hafiz al-Assad. Now, this was connected to a variety of things. Hafiz considered that these were adventurous, but he also, of course, had to deal with warnings from the Israelis and the Americans about Syrian intervention. And there was fear that, if there was a very strong Syrian intervention in support of overthrowing the state in Jordan, and the Israelis would bomb Damascus. It would cause serious problems. So that was part of the drama that we're discussing here.
And so essentially, Syrian tanks rolled into the country but didn't do anything.
Well, Syrian tanks rolled into the country. They did quite a bit. They took over the north of the country, the region around Irbid, the main city in the north, was taken over. It was announced as a liberated zone. There was even a liberated administration set up there. And the Fidai groups, took control for a while. But without air cover, the Jordanian military forces were able to push it back eventually. And in the meantime, Hafez al-Assad orchestrates a coup that he calls the corrective move. And he overthrows the government led by Salah Jadid in this period.
This is in November 1970 that Assad ousts fellow military Ba'athist Salah Jadid in a coup. How did this split between Jadid and Assad, who together, listeners will recall, together had ousted the civilian or traditional Syrian Ba'ath leadership in a 1966 coup, how did this new split amongst the military Ba'athists come about? And how did that split between Jadid and Assad fit into these longer internecine fights among Ba'athists between various ideological factions, military versus civilian factions, and also critically between the Iraqi and Syrian factions that we spent so much of the series discussing? And then lastly, what role did Syria's action, Assad's decision not to provide air cover to Syrian forces in Jordan during Black September, what role did that play in being the sort of proximate spark for the coup?
So there's two ways of viewing this question of the contradictions within the former Syrian comrades in this Ba'athist leadership post the 1966 coup. One is to think of it in ideological terms. And of course, there is an ideological facade to all of this provided by Assad and his opponents. And the other is to think of it in terms of personal quests for power. In my estimation, there is an ideological dimension, but it's not the strongest. The actual contestation over power was the dominant theme. Yes, Assad was advocating what he would have called a more realist approach, where Syria enters the state system and enters the state system game without having these grand ideas about exporting revolution or anything of that sort. And he, yes, on the internal economic front, he did want a more mixed model of socialism, where there would be elements of socialism but mixed with encouraging private enterprise. So there are ideological differences, but there are also personal quests for power connected to this. And really, it was clear that Hafez al-Assad was very shrewd and very effective from the very beginning to the very end of his life. I mean, he was definitely a very effective political player. He was ruthless, but he was also calculating. And every move he did was based on calculations that related to him achieving greater and greater power. That's clear for any serious observer. Now, you have supporters and fans of his that love their ruthlessness or that try to hide it. And those that try to hide it, they focus on the shrewdness. But I would definitely tell you a couple of things. One, somebody like him is not a theorist. He's not particularly well-read. He's not an intellectual, but he's smart. And he's a pragmatic actor in a very complex arena. And he deals with that arena using whatever tools he has, and he has no limits when it comes to using those tools. So if he needs to kill people, he will. He wouldn't do it necessarily just out of, for fun or out of, randomness. But he will do it, and he's done it on multiple occasions. If he needs to crack down, he will. And he created definitely a situation where the security state reached unprecedented levels in Syria. So when he did his corrective move, the way he dealt with his former comrades is very telling. They were all put into like tiny cells. They were all tortured. They were all, what difference would it have made if he had give them slightly better treatment, for example? Why not give somebody a suite in prison if he was your buddy for like 25 years or something? You know what I mean? And if you were subjected to danger together. So I hate to go too much into the psychology of it, but there is a bit of psychopathy involved here. My humble opinion, my personal opinion. These are people who, I wouldn't make it just restrict that analysis to Arab politics. I think there's empirical research that politics attracts psychopaths in a disproportionate way. I think in psychology, I have a friend who's a psychologist. She talks about that. So there are elements that we can see there that took place during this corrective move. Now, again, the ideological facade is, we're saving the country from these adventurous or taking it down an unknown path. Syria does not have the power to stand against the Americans, the Israelis, and everybody else, and or the regional allies. It needs to adjust to reality, and it needs stability. Stability becomes Hafez al-Assad's number one motto throughout his career. He says, look, we've had too much political change. What I'm going to do now is allow the state to be stable, which of course wins him a section of the old Syrian capital, who could find an economic avenue under this regime. It's not ideal for them, but stability and a bit of an opening for the private sector is an advantage for them.
Assad taking power in Syria in 1970, combined with Saddam and al-Bakr taking power in Iraq in 68, it really just completes the moral and political bankruptcy of the Ba'ath, a party that we really started this series discussing in many ways, a party founded to be something quite different. Why did Baathists take off down this road of brutal infighting between Baathists of various ideological factions, between military and civilian factions, and also, critically, between Iraqi and Syrian factions, a path that ultimately brought Baathists to these depressing, violently repressive, authoritarian endpoints in both Iraq and Syria?
Yeah, so, Daniel, this is a question that has haunted Baathists for many years. And what is, of course, any serious assessment will have to look at the fact that the party began to have a military wing and a civilian wing, and that becomes difficult. In both Iraq and Syria, this develops. The party also had a difficult experience with the United Arab Republic. It could not find the formula that allowed for an equilibrium with Nasser. It could not find the formula for having equilibrium with the communists earlier and with Qasim. And you can't just fault them for that. Of course, the other players had a role with it, but definitely there were different possible courses of action that might have spared the Ba'ath a lot of disastrous results that taken place. But the leadership of the Ba'ath basically got increasingly marginalized and increasingly lost the plot as the party expanded and as new elements from more military as opposed to civilian backgrounds started entering the party. At the end of the day, the party became dominated by figures that were not ideological, that did not belong to the intellectual classes. And I'm not saying that they're not intelligent or anything like that, but that means that the question of political commitment is different here. They're grounding in the main principles and values that the party was founded on was quite different. So, this is a party that started out as having a base mainly amongst young teachers. That was its main character, and now it continues to have this kind of element, but they're not the ones making the decisions. It becomes increasingly a state party, and a state party that is dominated by a security/military wing. And it will use the slogans. It might even deploy some of the ideas, might even adopt some of the policies. Both under Saddam and under Assad, there were elements of socialism introduced, and we should not dismiss that. There were serious experiments in introducing more egalitarian economic systems in these countries, and developing the countryside and nationalizing important natural resources. And that's all due to the Ba'athist tradition that these figures belong to. But that was also accompanied by a quest for power and by a quest for centralizing power. Ideologically, another variant that should be looked at, and this happens to not just the Ba'ath, but other political parties. The Soviet model gets increasingly adopted, and I'm talking here structurally. All Arab political parties on the left are somehow either adopting that model or trying to break away from it somehow. And maybe that's a problem across the left. So under the banner of democratic centralism, a lot of things that have nothing to do with democracy or centralism take place. And that becomes part of the phenomenon. It gives ideological justification for individual quests for power. So it's a mixed legacy. And by the way, much of what I do has to do with also saying we can't just purely vilify what took place. We have to look at it holistically. The biggest problem that we're left with in the 1970s and 80s under these regimes is the denial of political liberty. And that's a significant problem because it basically debilitates democracy. The second problem is we end up in geopolitical clashes within a revolutionary camp that could have been more united. The interferences in the Palestinian Revolution, and we'll talk about that in a second, produced negative results for the Palestinian Revolution, especially by Hafez, but less so by Saddam as well. But then you also have clashes between Syria and Iraq that come about that really affect the region in very negative ways. You have all sorts of arenas in which the geopolitics could have been improved on that. But then you have other aspects that have to be looked at more favorably. You had to focus on the sovereignty of the state in relation to empire. And that's not an insignificant theme. Both Saddam and Hafez were trying hard to achieve that and to protect that, for all their ills. There was also, as I mentioned, some social justice elements that were included, never in a radical fashion, but definitely there's some social democratic institutions, some welfare state institutions that got created, almost free medicine, almost free education, in some cases entirely free, support for farmers, some cooperative programs, and all of these are quite important.
This is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication. You've probably seen a lot of what they've published online, but they also have a beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin. Gamal Abdel Nasser died in September 1970, right in the midst of Black September. This marked the demise of the most pivotal figure in this entire series, an absolutely unparalleled icon of Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, and Arab socialism. Anwar Sadat, who we will discuss in more detail later on, he took over as president. But before we get to Sadat and the rest of this history, briefly, what was the immediate impact of Nasser's death, the death of the most towering figure in 20th century Arab history, really among the most legendary figures of this entire era of third worldism and revolutionary decolonization globally?
A sense of how important Nasser is can be gained from the vehemence with which he is approached by both by his opponents, as well as the admiration that is given to him by his supporters to this very day across the region. And I think, again, this tells you something about the character and its weight. I've checked the British record as on this era as good as anybody, and I'm talking about recently declassified documents, that kind of thing. And I've also had my fair share of looking at American records, and it's clear that Nasser was considered by the existing empires as the only or as the main serious threat to their project, but also as somebody that they needed to grapple with. So from the perspective of somebody who had a regional vision, definitely Nasser was the leader with the most important regional vision in the history that we've been talking about. You have some big figures operating in this period. Saudi Arabia's King Faisal is very important. Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq is very important, but nobody comes close to Nasser in terms of his influence, and his overall significance for this history, as you've indicated. This does not mean that everything is done is perfect, or that everything is done is bad. And as his supporters and detractors both would like us to respectively say. On a popular level, it was clear that his death was a huge shock. And his death was actually connected to Black September. Nasser dies as he's trying to broker a ceasefire, and as he's trying to broker a deal that would allow for an end to the fighting between the Jordanian monarchy and the Palestinian Revolution. It's clear that he might have had even some guilt because he did not intervene to stop Black September from happening. And this is a big debate that exists both in Palestinian circles as well as in Jordanian circles and elsewhere. Could Nasser have stopped what took place? Did he give King Hussein a green light? His relationship with the Fedayeen was very tense in that moment because he had accepted the Rogers Plan, the American plan, which was talking about a two-state solution, and which was exploring with Arab states the idea of negotiations along 242, along the UN Resolution 242. And of course, that leads to major demonstrations against him in Amman, and these are led by the different Palestinian revolutionary factions, including the movement of Arab nationalists, which were his former allies. So the PFLP and the PDFLP figures, all of them, whether it's Habash or Hawatmi, they're all rejecting it, and they're talking in almost insulting terms. In one of the demos, even some people put a face of a donkey on Nasser's picture. There's some stuff that was seen as crossing many lines. And in Palestinian autocritiques, that's actually focused on, because that's the one figure that might have been on a regional level able to stop a complete Jordanian crackdown. And it's one of the reasons why King Hussein also delayed. So in any case, so you have this clash with him, but he does feel guilty. We know that he feels very guilty about not intervening to stop the situation. He tries to broker again an agreement, and he helps create the conditions for smuggling Arafat out of Amman. And he brokers an agreement in Cairo, but it stressed him out. And he wasn't sleeping throughout that time. He was very ill. He was not doing well. Some people have theories that he was poisoned. I don't actually believe that. His former Soviet doctor has appeared in multiple interviews where he said, look, he's suffering from a heart condition for a long time, and I kept on telling him, stop working. He was a workaholic. You need to take some time off, and you need less stress. Otherwise, you're going to kill yourself. So that's an important issue to emphasize, though, that Nasser's death is connected to the Palestinian cause with which he was connected for all his life. Secondly, when he dies, something remarkable happens in the streets of Amman, which was a wounded city that had just gone through this horrible civic conflict between people who are very close to each other. And by the way, one of the myths of Black September is that it was Jordanians versus Palestinians. Actually, there were a lot of Jordanians in Fida'i factions, and there were a lot of Palestinians in the Jordanian army. And every family has people on both sides, including mine, including others. This is part of the mythology that then gets created around it. But when Nasser dies, black flags are raised by everybody, and the fighting stops. This is actually how the fighting stops in Amman. The minute the radio stations start putting on the Quran, that's a signal that somebody big has died. This is what happens in, by the way, the Middle East. Like when somebody big dies, suddenly the radio broadcast stops, you have Quranic verses. That means that it's a signal, and his death is announced. Everybody tries to scramble to find the black piece of cloth. They raise it. All of Amman turns into a city raising black flags. And Fida'is drop their guns. The army drops its gun. It's a chilling moment. And when you interview people that lived through it, from both sides actually, they all recall it very vividly. Everybody knew that something ominous is going to happen to the region. They were used to this leadership, whether they liked it or not, whether they attacked it or not, whether they critiqued it or not. They knew that overall it had created a gigantic shift away from imperial control for the first time in the region, and that it was trying to chart an independent path, and a path that would allow for some unity and social change. Now, from a, of course, radical leftist critique, that change was never full, and it was not, and some would say it wasn't even close to what it should be. But there was no doubt that this was the most serious challenge to the regional order in the post-war period. For the Palestinian cause, his death is a disaster because he's succeeded by an opportunistic figure who was famous for changing colors all the time, a total chameleon, respected widely in the West because he's a Western agent, but hated actually widely in our region. In Egypt, he has a mixed legacy of popular support and hatred because multiple regimes keep on recycling his image as one of somebody who's opened new opportunities for Egypt. But we can talk about that in a second. Anwar Sadat, of course, is the person we're talking about.
In 1971, in the wake of Black September, the PLO established its new headquarters in Beirut. How did the PLO respond to the events of Black September in Jordan? What sort of blow was it to lose its base there? And then how did they decide to move forward in Lebanon?
So in the case of the discussion within the PLO, the problem with the loss of Jordan is that you lost several hundred kilometers of borders with the Israeli settler colonial state. And you've also lost something that people refer to as Khazan al-Thawra, the storage tank of the revolution in a way. Or that's the wrong word, maybe the spring of the revolution, like something like that. It's where you have the largest Palestinian numerical presence anywhere outside of Palestine. It's a huge presence. Even if you look at the world's map today, Amman would count as the world's largest Palestinian city. Bigger than Jerusalem, bigger than Nablus, bigger than Hebron, bigger. It's in purely statistical terms. It's a huge number of Palestinians in this country. They constitute at least half the population, if not, by some estimates, much higher than that. So that's something significant. You also lost a population, the East Bank Jordanians, who are very committed to the revolution. So also you had a big section that would have fought with you from there. And this had like disastrous repercussions. So the only area that was left where there could be any form of independent Palestinian revolutionary action or margin for independent Palestinian revolutionary action was Lebanon now. There, the Palestinian revolution had to undergo a series of reevaluations of what took place in Jordan and how it could do things better now that it moved to Lebanon. One of the main themes that were discussed in Jordan, or in relation to the way of working in Jordan, was that in Jordan, the Jordanian national movement got absorbed into the Palestinian revolutionary structures. And that became like an area for self-critique and for autocritique, because they were saying that allowed or made it easier for the regime to use the logic of local nationalism to crack down on the revolution. You know, if you say this is about Palestinians and it's what do we have to do with them, and you know, if you try to create a xenophobic feeling around that while encouraging the logic of the state sovereignty, that's made easier if you don't have a clear set of organizations that operate under a Jordanian banner. And of course, these existed in the 1950s very strongly. We talked about them before. But by the time we entered the period of 67 to 70, most of their cadres had entered Palestinian organizations or established offshoots that were operating in the Palestinian revolutionary arena. Like a good example would be the Ba'ath. Look at the Ba'ath. They established Sa'iqa. The leader of Sa'iqa is actually the guy who establishes it, is an East Banker Jordanian, very highly respected by everyone, Dafi Jam'ani. He ends up, by the way, in Assad's jails as a result of the corrective move. He's a member of the national leadership of the Ba'ath. But he's operating under Sa'iqa, which is a Palestinian formation that gains membership in the PLO. That is a constituent member of the PLO. This phenomena applies to the Arab nationalists. It applies to the Baathists. It applies even to sections of the communists. It causes a split in the Communist Party, actually, the Jordanian one. So this is an issue that in Lebanon they're careful not to do. They start operating in cooperation with what was called the Lebanese National Movement. Yeah, in Lebanon, besides creating the alliance with existing popular forces there, which was, of course, very important for them given what had transpired earlier in Jordan, and deciding not to fold them into the PLO, which could have been a course of action, of course, a potential one. There was another set of decisions were taking place relating to developing different aspects of the Palestinian Revolution that were social aspects. And really, this is something that is very important to consider when we look at the history of the Palestinian Revolution. Most people look at it from a military perspective and from a diplomatic perspective. But it's so important to focus also on the social dynamics, the popular mobilization dynamics, the fact that you had a growth in the women's union, a major growth, a restructuring of it, actually. So after Jordan, by the way, when the exit to Beirut happens, you have major changes where different branches of the union start, operating. There's a structure where the national structure exists, but also local structures are operating. You have much bigger budgets invested in that. More people are allocated roles, organizing roles. Same for the workers' union. Same for GUPS, the General Union of Palestine Students. It's operating on a huge level. All the training camps expand when it comes to the ideological dimension. So you have now cadre schools established, both for Fatah and for the PFLP. The medical side is expanded. And some scholars refer to it as a phenomena of state building. Yazid Saigh in particular views it from that prism. I actually disagree with that. I think what was happening was a deepening of revolutionary building. And you cannot have revolutionary mobilization without having an intimate relationship with the masses out of which the revolution is going to come. That was the kind of realization that most Palestinian organizations were arriving at. And they've really learned that from the experience of Jordan, that you needed to build from the bottom up. You needed to expand the social work and really root the organizations in society. So this coincided with an event that took place in Lebanon under the banner of, or the title of the liberation of the camps. In 1969, you had this remarkable process taking place across the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, where essentially the PLO launched an armed rebellion against the presence of the Lebanese army inside the Palestinian camps. And the camps now had their own internal self-governance. So the Lebanese army could not enter them. And of course, the Lebanese army used to harass people there. They used to arbitrarily arrest people. These camps were under the harsh control of the Deuxième Bureau, which used to wreak havoc in them. People were not allowed to build. People were not allowed to talk. Any congregation more than 2 people would be counted as illegal. There were so many restrictions on people's lives. That ended with this operation, which included, by the way, even a naval landing in some of the camps. There were innovative moves that led to the liberation of the camps, and we end up with a situation where first the PLO has a strong power base in these camps, which are spread across the country. But secondly, it's also establishing a strong grounding amongst communities that had been marginalized by Lebanon's sectarian formula, and in particular had been marginalized by the French effort to create Maronite dominance in Lebanon. Now, of course, there were different degrees of allegiance to the Palestinian Revolution or connection to it, but you saw that it had some natural allies in the sense that, for example, the leaderships of Shiite communities tended to be very sympathetic to it, but more importantly, the people themselves, partly because most Shiite populations were in the south, in the region of Lebanon that borders Palestine and that had very intimate connections with it. A lot of them had worked in Palestine before 48. A lot of them had intermarried with Palestinians. So there was that social dimension that was very strong there. But then you also had Sunni communities that allied with Palestinians, sometimes for religious reasons, that they belonged to the same sect, that they saw Palestinians as a natural ally in improving their own sect's position, but others for progressive reasons, because they belonged to more radical movements and so on. You had, within Christian communities, it was more likely that you would get less hostility from the Greek Orthodox Church, for example, and other communities that had a strong basis in Palestinian society as well. Of course, the Druze leadership was allied with the revolution, and some people give it an ideological interpretation, that Kamal Jumblat wanted to see a Lebanon free of sectarianism, and so the revolution as a major ally in that. Others give it, a more realpolitik interpretation, saying that he was trying to operate in the sectarian arena, and so the Palestinian Revolution as helping him with the balance of power in Lebanon. Regardless of the reason, however, you have all of these communities operating with the Palestinians. And then you have an anti-sectarian tradition, and we've referred to this earlier. All of the major left-wing parties want to support the revolution and the Palestinians. So PLO starts working with them. So it's creating, first of all, social mobilization amongst its own ranks, but also it's contributing to that, the aforementioned Lebanese communities and political circles. But secondly, it's building a strong alliance with existing Lebanese groups that did not see the status quo as sustainable or desirable. And thirdly, it was trying to learn from the lessons of the experience in Jordan as it was pursuing both tracks.
That same year in 1971, that the PLO established its new headquarters in Beirut, a Palestinian organization called Black September was launched, and it carried out various killings, hostage-taking, plane hijacking, sabotage, most spectacularly the killing and kidnapping of members of the Israeli team at the 1972 Munich Olympics. How did this organization emerge, and what were the connections between the PLO and the organization Black September? And then lastly, what were the broader movement's assessments of the organization and the tactics that it employed?
Yeah, so I must say, Daniel, it's a very Western question that you're asking here. I know that you're anti-colonial in spirit, body, and mind, so we'll forgive you for that. But in reality, unfortunately, in discussions around Palestine, you're bound to get some colonialist thinking entering any conversation in the U.S. So I'm glad you are asking this question for that reason, because I think we need to correct the way we look at these things. First of all, Black September is a marginal phenomena in Palestinian history as an organization. But it takes up a lot of space in discussions of the Palestinian Revolution in the West, because most discussions in the Palestinian Revolution in the West are not interested in the revolution itself, this grand phenomena that mobilized hundreds of thousands of refugee people, dispersed people who had been destroyed, exiled from its land, oppressed, and it was trying to reconstitute itself and regain its homeland and achieve liberation and return, all the while playing a huge revolutionary role in the region to which it belonged. You know, that population, all of its activities are reduced to terrorism, and the favorite subjects tend to be terror organizations. The case of Black September, that was actually not related to the PLO. The PLO is an umbrella group. And we've described it before. It's not even a group. It's supposed to be the national representative of the Palestinian people, but it is comprised of organizations that are constituent organizations of the PLO and that are represented in its different structures. The Parliament in Exile, which is the Palestinian National Council, that's the highest authority. Those groups are represented in it alongside independents and alongside representatives of the different Palestinian unions. But and they're also representative of the executive committee of the PLO and of course the top leadership, which is the office of the chairman. But that does not mean that you can say this or that group is the PLO. Okay. Now, Fatah, which is one of the largest groups in the PLO, Black September is an offshoot of the Fatah organization, but its relationship with it is very murky. Definitely, there were Fatah figures that played a key role in it, in particular Abu Dawood, and definitely key Fatah figures, Abu Iyad, had a connection with that process. You know, that is clear. It was seen on the internal arena as Fatah's offshoot that would compete with the PFLP's offshoot, which is the external operations. And they both enjoyed a certain level of autonomy in a way. You know, they were working without going back necessarily to the highest authorities within their respective organizations. They both had a focus on a very tactical focus. They were focused on things like hijackings. They were focused on assassinations and so on. Assassinations were mainly focused on the Arab arena. There weren't that many of them, but the one, of course, that was most influential was the assassination of Wasf al-Tal, which was Jordan's prime minister, and a figure that was seen as overseeing post-Black September formula in Jordan. And he was associated with the Black September policy very strongly. That figure is of course, the most important, by the way, figure for the Jordanian right now. And he's seen as, he's the most important figure also for a tradition in Jordan that emphasizes Jordanian national separateness from broader Palestinian Jordanian society. So that local nationalism that we were talking about, it's often associated with Wasfi. Although, FYI, like he had a different tradition. He was involved in more pan-Arab projects before. We can talk about that if we want to later on. But so he is a more complex figure than he's presented by both the Palestinian Revolution and the Jordanian authorities. In any case, that assassination was the biggest event actually in the Arab arena that they were engaged in. On the international front, you mentioned Munich. That was indeed an operation. What they would say is that they didn't actually kill the athletes. They intended to exchange them for the Palestinian hostages that lay in Israeli jails. And we consider all of them to be hostages, by the way, because they're taken out of their homes, they're arrested by Israeli authorities, and there's thousands of them at any given moment. So that was the outlook at the time on the part of organizations like that. Of course, the Israeli authorities then pushed for an operation in which there was an armed confrontation, and these athletes were killed. The reason why I say this is actually it has contemporary relevance. If you look at what is happening in Gaza today in relation to those Israelis that were taken prisoner by Hamas, their situation, of course, is they're subjected to the Hannibal doctrine often. Even some of the people that were killed in kibbutzes surrounding Gaza on October 7 were subjected to the Hannibal doctrine. The idea that in a hostage situation, the Israeli authorities would rather kill both the hostage takers and the hostages because they don't want any negotiations to take place. They prefer that over exchanges or negotiations, which they deem to be signs of weakness. So rather than treating these things politically, some people approach them as purely a way of saying the Palestinian Revolution is immoral. But the reality is, of course, all of this is political. None of this scene is not embedded in politics. And we know this from the case of Ireland, other cases like that. There were English people that would say the only discussion of the IRA was bombings in Manchester or attacks on civilians. But then the bigger questions get lost in that equation. In any case, what also gets lost is the fact that these were not the groups that were central to the overall revolutionary phenomenon. This was just one tactic out of many. The main feature of actually the Palestinian Revolution at that time was the mobilization of troops that would operate as guerrilla fighters. And that's on the military side. And on the social side, it was the mobilization of Palestinian society as a whole. That's why you always had critiques internally towards Black September and also the external relations branch of the PFLP within their own organizations. Those critiques differed than the Western ones. They were not contesting, they were not saying like, why are you doing terrorism? Or they were not moralistic in character. But what they were contesting was the question of how beneficial is this for the revolution? Can you carry out a revolution with plane hijackings and an assassination here and there? The answer from those involved in the organization is, well, the Israelis do that all the time. They've assassinated way more. They've done all of that. Was not necessarily convincing to all Palestinian revolutionaries or even the majority of them, because there was this view that what's the priority, and the number one priority, is to increase the military capacity of the revolution on the ground to be able to create a major buildup where you could confront the Israeli forces in a long-term people's war.
How was it that this framework first took hold and then developed, that that Israeli violence was legitimate and always inherently a matter of self-defense, while all Palestinian violence was and is a form of terrorism. This doesn't mean, of course, that one cannot morally object to certain actions taken by whatever faction over the long history of armed struggle, but after all, it was colonialist and Zionist violence that ethnically cleansed much of Palestine of its indigenous population, and that has continued to do so in 1967 and then ever since then. And of course, since 1948, Israel has killed far, far, far more Palestinians than Palestinians have killed Israelis, just to belabor a point that's obvious to anyone who's gotten to this point in the series. How and when, though, did this framework take root and become such common sense in the West?
I mean, it was used earlier. It was used as early as the beginnings of the British mandate, and of course, it continued to be used whenever there was a Palestinian uprising or revolution. So we see it every time there's anything like that. And definitely in the 1970s, the external operations and the operations of Black September, both the external operations of PFLP and the operations of Black September, bring the cost of what's going on in Palestine to the West. And of course, that was part of their logic. I didn't mention this bit. We mentioned it in an earlier episode. For the PFLP, it was the notion of chasing the enemy everywhere, and including in the countries that they saw as sponsoring the Israeli state. So if the West is sponsoring the Israeli state and gets away with it every time, it never feels any social cost to it or any political cost. That was the kind of argument that they were approaching there. Of course, that allowed then Western governments to say these are international terrorists. In a way, much of the security set up in airports and so on belongs to that period. It's because of Palestinian operations, so that's a byproduct. Of course, as we know, states of exception become part of everyday life, and that comes out of course, that period. So definitely Palestinians get more absorbed in terrorism. If earlier they just were erased from the picture during the 50s and 60s, and then you suddenly start hearing the word Palestine around the time when you have Battle of Karame, and you have like some Palestinian independent military capacity developing, but then it becomes a big discussion with these operations. And that was, of course, the argument of people like Black September and the external operations in PFLP. They were saying, these people are trying to erase us. So only these operations will allow them to talk about Palestine. They're forced to talk about it. Others, of course, had a different assessment in the Palestinian arena. They were saying there's other ways of making them talk about it and making them stop their support for this Israeli state. So this discourse, though, that you referred to, Daniel, I want to mention another point that's important to know. It is not just restricted to Palestinians. And it comes out of a broader anti-colonial dynamic that starts actually with the Americas. And I really think that we have to emphasize this point.
It's the day before July 4th, and that's a day that sometimes Americans read the Declaration of Independence, and they can read right there that one of the North American settler colonists' rationales for rebelling against the King of England was a total projection of violent tendencies onto the colonized victim of the colonizer's violence. Here's the actual text. This is amongst the complaints against the king. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
Absolutely. And the other interesting thing about that, of course, is in the meantime, in the American Revolution, we have the right to bear arms being celebrated and the discussions around that, and the right for the colonists to go and fight for their liberty. So their right to practice violence is enshrined and celebrated as far as they're concerned. If we're talking about American colonists, if we're talking about any, let's say, major group that belongs to these countries that are the Western countries, except for the Irish, of course, they're always treated, because they're colonized, they're treated in a different way. But if it's a colonist nation, then it has a right to practice violence, and it's and we've seen it. Like, I mean, I always mention this in lectures in my class when I talk about these dimensions. Of course, nowadays students don't watch Westerns, but maybe you did, Daniel, at some point, or they used to put them on TV, across the world, and it's always the Indians attacking a train, so-called Indians, of course, attacking a train. So it's the indigenous people fighting for no reason, attacking for no reason, and they're usually killing an innocent white woman, and then they're scalping and they're whatever. And nobody talks about, well, what's the train doing there, and how did it get there, and also so this is like part of the pattern. So it's not just Palestinians that are subjected to this. It starts with the indigenous people of this country. It includes also enslaved people in this country. I mean, look at all the discussions around enslaved people's rebellions, and it becomes about their violence. It's not that they're subjected to the worst violence that has been known in history. This evil institution that is. I mean, we don't need to expound on it, because I believe in the dig you talk about it all the time. But I mean, I can't think of a more evil institution in human history. It's like unbelievable violence. It's based on violence. Everything about it is violent. But no, it's these enslaved people are the problem, and so it becomes African Americans become the problem, and of course, whenever a people is subjugated, for the imperialists and the colonialists, that's part of the logic. Now, that's why it's not coincidental, by the way, that in the literature on the laws of war, the main challenge to this came actually from a Palestinian professor. So who happens to have been to be my mentor, actually. I mean, Carmen Abulsi. She just got honored actually in the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies for her lifetime achievements, but she had actually written a great book called Traditions of War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Law. And it's about precisely that. How do different traditions of war come about? And this even happens in Europe. In fact, Karma shows that the laws of war were privileging imperial powers within Europe. Even they started actually through doing that. So they were geared against the Poles in the 18th century. They were geared against the Corsicans and the virtuous republic that was established there. They were designed to allow for colonial violence and imperial violence, and to prevent resistance on the part of people that are in a different structural position. And that applies definitely to the Palestinian people.
Before we get to the October War of 1973, what more generally did the guerrilla struggle against Israel look like during this period in between Black September and the October War of 1973? And then how was Israel responding? One notable Israeli tactic was assassinations, an assassination campaign that included really important cultural figures like the PFLP leader and poet Ghassan Kanafani, who was killed alongside his 17-year-old niece by a Mossad car bomb in Beirut in 1972.
Yeah, so in this period, the vast majority of operations were actually geared towards establishing, first of all, a presence in the areas bordering Palestine, which meant in the Lebanese south. Then carrying out reconnaissance unit work inside the areas across the border, which were under the control of the Israeli colonial state, and sometimes carrying out attacks in those areas. So those were the three types of the main kind of types of operations that were going on. For the most part, actually, most attacks happened inside Lebanese territory, where you had Israelis bombarding or carrying out actions. And sometimes these were actions that took on the form you just described, which are assassination attempts. So if you want to look at it structurally, because this is what people sometimes miss. They say, well, where's the effectiveness? Why wasn't it, and they make comparisons with stuff that happened much later, like let's say Hezbollah in 2006. And what is forgotten is that actually much of the period of the Palestinian presence in Lebanon was geared towards establishing a military presence in the south. So that was a struggle in its own right, because it meant that you had to overcome Lebanese army restrictions. You had to overcome Israeli raids and bombardments, which were constant. You had to carry out, very complex set of negotiations with the local villagers and the local society surrounding you. Nevertheless, you had bases established, you had operations beginning to commence. And then, in that context, you also had to explore the territory. So from a military perspective, there was a lot that needed to be done. And much of it had to do with setting up an infrastructure that could be later deployed effectively to carry out bigger operations. In the meantime, you also needed small operations that would accumulate to ensure that the mobilization would grow. So we had this dimension that was going on. You needed to inspire in the masses the idea that there are operations happening every day. You joining a movement isn't just a pointless activity. You're actually, because people wanted to fight. But if you're a military planner, you understood that there's more to this than just an immediate fight. Actually, you needed to build capacity. So, there were all sorts of dimensions to this process. But the Israelis were throughout, their main objective was to prevent the emergence of a serious infrastructure that could then create a direct threat to them. And as that infrastructure became increasingly possible, that's when they really made sure to go all out and go and root it out completely, which was, of course, the Israeli invasion of 82, which we'll talk about later on. Yeah, so you had another Israeli dimension that was going on that was presented as responding to Palestinian action, but really it's part of a more comprehensive policy. It has nothing to do with responding. Was the assassination of intellectuals and leading PLO political figures. So the big events in this regard, we have multiple ones, and they kept on going, by the way, kept on happening. And, this is where Black September, the organization you asked about, also enters into the equation, because it becomes like there's this constant struggle around assassinations abroad that they're connected to. But locally in the region, in Beirut, you have a great intellectual, an amazing Palestinian novelist, really like a legendary one, Ghassan Kanafani. And I really encourage people to read him because he writes from a very sensitive humanist lens. Like, for example, Returning to Haifa is a very short novella, but it has this incredible dynamic between a Palestinian family from Haifa and a Holocaust surviving Jewish family that comes and takes up their home. And they have this dialogue over a lost son of the other family that gets adopted by the Jewish family. So it's like an incredible, but by the way, it's a novella that also understands the Jewish plight in Europe very sensitively. This is somebody who is an internationalist. This is somebody who establishes the PFLP's main political, organ, the newspaper Al-Hadaf. After the split between the DF and the PF, the PF loses, of course, its main mouthpiece, which was Al-Hurriya, which was the mouthpiece of the movement Arab nationalists. So then now they have to move and establish their own outfit. Kanafani does that. He establishes Al-Hadaf, the goal. He's pursuing Marxist-Leninist analysis. He's discussing all sorts of intellectual issues. Liberation of women, social liberation. He's incredible intellectual, truly great novelist. Anyways, this person, who of course had been dispossessed from Jaffa in 1948, had lived a life of constant struggle, ends up losing his life at a very, very young age, and his niece gets killed with him in a car explosion. They start saying, well, he's a spokesperson for a terrorist organization, this and that, which is, of course, the usual logic. But by losing him, we lost a great intellectual figure. And that's part of the pattern that we refer to as scholasticide, the killing of intellectuals, thinkers, the killing of scholars, the murder of educators, the destruction of universities and schools, from K to 12, from first year of university to PhD. All of that happens systematically. So that's the assassination of Kanafani in 1972. Now, of course, sadly enough, and this is a very sad story, when Kanafani gets assassinated, he gets featured on the pages of FIFTEENTH Thawra, which is the main PLO publication organ. But he doesn't get featured enough. So their editor, Kamal Nasser, his friend, a poet from Fatah, but a great and wonderful poet. He wants to. He was like, "How dare you not feature him enough?" So they go and do like a big feature, and he says like he wants to be buried next to him if he ever gets killed. And of course, Kamal Nasser was a Christian and Kanafani was Muslim. Normally, people are buried in separate cemeteries, but they did end up getting buried next to each other in the martyrs' graveyard in Beirut. For any visitor to Beirut, you'll find so many Palestinian revolutionary figures there, including this one and these two great Palestinian writers. And Kamal Nasser gets assassinated the following year as part of what was perhaps the most important assassination attempt, because it killed. He was primarily targeted for military reasons, but of course, it's illegitimate to target people in their homes regardless. But he had been heading something that was called the Western Sector, Qata al-Gharbi, which is a section of Fatah that was responsible for organizing the buildup of revolutionary capacity in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. So they were called the Western Section. So he was clearly a major target of the Israelis because they did not want to see a revolution happen there eventually. But that assassination actually causes a shift in the policy of the PLO in Lebanon. And this is quite consequential, because what becomes clear is that the Lebanese authorities are not protecting Palestinian political figures in Lebanon, in Beirut, and that's their job. So the PLO starts increasingly bringing in armed units to protect its main leaders in this area, okay, and its offices and other establishments and installations. That brings it away from the countryside in the south and more into the capital, Beirut, which creates an element of contradiction with the Lebanese state that gets heightened more and more. Its presence in the urban areas gets felt much more after this assassination.
Let's turn to the 1973 October War, when Syria and Egypt, both of which had territories occupied by Israel since 1967, launched a combined attack against Israel, with the U.S. strongly backing Israel and the Soviets behind the Arab states. The war wasn't exactly an Israeli defeat, and yet it reinvigorated Arab political and military confidence and humbled Israel. The war also prompted Arab oil-producing states, not the entirety of OPEC, but its Arab members, led by Saudi Arabia, to impose an oil embargo on the United States and other countries aligned with Israel. Why did the war play out the way that it did, operationally and then geopolitically, in terms of both this regional balance of forces between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab states, and also this larger balance of forces of the global Cold War?
Right. So, we need to remind our listeners, Daniel, of something we mentioned before, which is after 1967, of course, the Arab states lost a lot of land belonging to them. And that included, of course, Egypt and Syria. Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula, which was so important for Egypt. Syria lost the Golan Heights. The whole situation was a total mess. The Israelis were enjoying this period where they were pretending to be, like a force that is above the law, but also cannot be defeated. There was this mythology around it. And Nasser had actually initiated a program to confront that. He was trying to encourage the Soviet Union, with which he was allied, to give him better weapons. He was carrying out a massive attempt to rebuild the army along new lines, more effective lines. He had initiated a war, what was known as a war of attrition on the boundaries to prepare for something bigger. So there was this situation where it was clear that the Arab states could not stand still when large swaths of their territory were lost, especially Egypt and Syria. This effort, of course, continued to rearm and rebuild the militaries of both countries, continued after the death of Nasser, but along the lines that were set out by him. Sadat was determined to carry out action. He knew that it was needed. But of course, he had a different vision for action than the one that Nasser did, or than the one that his new partner, Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, had. Sadat considered that the Americans held the keys to the region, and that he wanted to carry out a war that would lead to the initiation of a peace process that would result in the return of Egyptian territory to him. So this was his model. So a limited war was what he was trying to achieve. In the case of Hafiz al-Assad, he wanted a war that would bring back the Golan, which would mean like a more determined, liberation war, at least for Syrian territories. Now, the realities on the ground meant, Sadat's vision eventually won, because he war without him could not take place. The saying goes, there's no war without Egypt and no peace without Syria. That was coming from that period. You can't carry out like a serious challenge to the Israeli state without major military intervention on the part of Egypt, at least when it comes to classical armies wars. And to do that, of course, better weapons needed to be achieved and procured from the Soviets. Eventually, Sadat does a trick to do that. He takes a tough stance with them, as Haykal notes. He calls it like a tough stance with the Soviet friend. وقفة مع الصديق السوفيتي. That's how he framed it. So you needed expulsion of Soviet experts and creating a whole drama to be able to get greater commitment from the Soviets. Because something like this obviously required very strong weaponry and it required air cover. And essentially the war required crossing the canal, Suez Canal. And this is a very expensive thing to do. Once the weaponry is procured and secured, and once the plans happen, the plan was actually very effectively implemented. The Israelis thought that there was no war. There was even a betrayal to both Syria and Egypt. Jordan's King Hussein went to Golda Meir and warned her. He thought he would get some credits out of that. But luckily for the region, she ignored him, did not believe him. Others, there were some Israeli spies that were suggesting there was a war. There was this thinking that it wasn't going to happen on the part of the Israeli government. But it did happen. And the Israelis were only able to push back the Syrian and Egyptian forces as a result of huge, enormous American commitment, like a massive airlift was established of weapons and support of all kinds. And of course, Kissinger was behind much of that policy. And, this starts a tradition in American politics, of course, of committing weapons to Israel more than the combined weaponry of all the Arab states around it. So it continues to this day, by the way, this commitment it's from the United States. So that's orchestrated in that context. But despite the fact that you have this U.S.-sponsored pushback, one political, and despite the fact that, and this is the focus actually of many Arab political commentators, that Sadat could have gone further. He could have actually, had he allowed Egyptian troops to proceed much further into the depths of the Israeli state. Who knows? It could have reached Tel Aviv. We don't know if that's realistic or not. But they could have gone far, at least further than they did. And that's basically the line that's taken by even one of the main Egyptian military figures at the time, the leader of the army, Shadli. In his memoirs and testimonies, he says, look, we were politically stopped as an army. We could have gone further. That was certainly the position of Hafez al-Assad. He felt tricked. He felt that Sadat did not want to win the war. He just wanted to initiate a political process. And that he did. He got Kissinger engaged with him. There was this whole shallow diplomacy. Suddenly, after the war, there was all this discussion of we need a peaceful conference, because these states, this time they didn't push the war further, but if there's no political process, maybe they will in the future. Another major war could break out.
Yeah, I want to talk about the diplomatic situation that played out throughout the 1970s in the wake of the October War, and there are a lot of moving pieces here, some of which you were just getting into. First, I want to talk about the larger regional geopolitics and specifically how they fit into the global Cold War. And then I want to get into how the PLO approached these questions and the intense debates that all provoked within the Palestinian national movement. So first, after 1973, what were the Soviet and U.S. aims in the region in general and regarding Palestinians in particular? My sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is that the Soviets essentially accepted the Zionist conquest of the 1948 territories, what in mainstream ideologically loaded Western language would be described as, quote unquote, accepting Israel's right to exist. In other words, the Soviets were not at all dedicated to liberating the entirety of Palestine or to the PLO's vision of a singular democratic state. They wanted some form of comprehensive settlement that included a two-state solution. And then on the U.S. end, it seems as though Henry Kissinger, who served under both Nixon and then Ford, that he was driven by an overwhelming desire to ice Palestinians and the PLO out of any Arab-Israeli negotiations and then settlement, and then for any settlement of the Palestinian question to be essentially imposed on the PLO. And that, motivated by that and the objective of just driving the Soviets out of the Middle East entirely, despite the U.S. pretending to be committed to détente. Is this right? How do you assess the U.S. and Soviet aims and postures here?
Right. So you're right to say that the Soviets were committed to a two-state solution, and it's not a two-state solution that ran along Palestinian lines. In many ways, they had accepted a settler colonial state, as you mentioned, in 1948. They never questioned the right of that state to continue. They even accepted the expansion of the territory of the state beyond the boundaries that were given to it by the UN. So essentially, we have the Soviets supporting, they wanted the Palestinian state, however, to emerge in 67, along 67 lines. And that's, of course, after the Palestinian Revolution starts working. Because before that, they weren't even talking about Palestine and Palestinians. Everybody was just pretending that it's just an issue between Jordan and Egypt and the Israeli state. So it's an Arab-Israeli conflict, not a Palestinian-Zionist conflict. The Americans had a different outlook. The Americans keep on talking about a two-state solution, but the honest truth is they've long been supporting, and structurally, just an Israeli solution that would circumvent the Palestinians. They want to have Israel accepted by the surrounding Arab countries, especially Henry Kissinger. He plays a big role in this. And interestingly enough, by the way, Henry Kissinger, he spends the entirety of the 70s ensuring that Palestinians don't have a place on the table. And recently, in interviews after October 7th, the main point that he kept on making is Hamas cannot have a seat on the table in this context. And this is very interesting because that's his whole outlook, is no matter what, you keep the Palestinians out. Of course, he's a committed Zionist. We know this. He's an anti-Arab person. He's incredibly racist. Like an imperialist. He committed crimes in Vietnam. It's not just particular to this region. This is a very typical imperialist character, but of the heavyweight. Like it's like you get these characters like the Churchills and the Kissingers that have done so much damage globally that. It's really unfortunate. But of course, Palestine was part of the damage they created, and it's severe. In the case of Palestine, what they've done to our people is just awful. And I wish they would be tried, but unfortunately, they tend to live long and healthy lives and live in fancy mansions, and that's one of the sad realities of the world we live in. That imperialists and capitalists thrive while others die, unfortunately. But of course, I'm an optimist, Daniel, and I don't want to overstate. I do think that this should not be personalized as well, because these are representatives of structures of power that exist in our world, and I do believe that one day these structures will be overthrown in the case of Palestine and in other cases, in the same way that Kissinger was defeated in Vietnam and his likes. They will eventually be defeated in Palestine. And what's important for us is not their defeat, but the victory of the people and the freedom of the people themselves. So that's what matters, and equality for everyone there. So in any case, equality was not something these people believe in. They wanted to settle a colonial state that would be incorporated into the region, accepted by it at the expense of the people, the indigenous population there. The PLO, its entire diplomacy in this period is geared towards ensuring that it gets a place on the table. And to do that, it has a bunch of steps that it needs to make. First of all, it needs to gain Arab recognition that is more official than it had before. So prior to this period, there is Arab support for the establishment of the PLO, of course, but there's a lot of tension around who represents Palestinian people because of the fact that a constituent member of the Arab League, Jordan, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, claims that it represents the West Bank. And this becomes a big, problem. And they're opposed to PLO representation. So the aftermath of the 73 war, we see an effort to increase Arab recognition through the Arab League, and that gets secured. Okay, so you have the situation where the Arab League passes recognition, and then that paves the way for recognition in the United Nations through inviting the chairman of the PLO to address it. And that becomes the famous 1974 speech that Arafat gives there. I think that Kissinger knew that he could start a process that the minute he opens the door of the US to these regional states, they will exit the Soviet orbit. He understood very well that most of these states went to the Soviet orbit not by choice, but out of necessity. In case of Egypt, definitely. With the Syrians, he also understood that Hafez al-Assad was a realist, and that he's not necessarily wedded to the Soviet Union. He wants Syrian sovereignty, and he does not trust the United States, but he will engage with the United States on a bunch of files. And he did, as was the case, of course, in the Syrian entry in Lebanon in 76. So, but some of the scholarship now just centers it on Cold War dynamics. I actually think that the main thing that Kissinger was doing was bolstering the Israeli state. That's his anchoring point here.
Following up on that last question, was Kissinger's approach here motivated by Cold War ambitions, specifically to push the Soviet Union out of the Middle East, or was this more a matter of Henry Kissinger's own ideological commitment to Israel, his personal ideology, him being an ardent Zionist?
There's definitely, Daniel, elements of Cold War mentality in operation here. And of course, the Cold War always plays a big role in American politics. And Kissinger was very involved in it. But there's also a specificity for Kissinger's dealing with the Israeli state, specifically when it comes to its place in the Middle East. I think a lot of the scholarship assumes or presumes that there's only one way of conducting a Cold War in this region, and that way is to support Israel. That is not the case. Kissinger's entire policy was geared towards strengthening the Israeli state, sidelining the Palestinians from the entire equation, and conducting essentially a situation where Arab states are broken up, where they cannot present a unified front. And of course, the unifying front in Arab politics at the time was the Palestine question. Now, why I say it's so important to think about this in more nuanced ways than usual. I happen to be one of the people that has checked consistently histories of the Arab right and how they talk to empire, based on documents, based on their internal deliberations with the empire. And when you look at the ways in which the Arab right was communicating at the time with the American empire, remember, these are the people that you'd want to focus on in the Cold War. People like King Faisal, people like the Gulf rulers, people like even King Hussein and others. The emphasis in all of their deliberations with the United States and with its ally Britain was on the fact that the Israeli state is a liability, that it is opening up many spaces for dissent, for the spread of communist ideas, for alignment with the Soviet Union. I mean, let us not forget, why is it that every Arab state that took a radical path turned to the Soviet Union? Initially, it had to do with armaments, and initially it had to do with armaments that were connected very much to the wars with the Israeli state. Now, that does not mean that there were not radical forces that sought some form of arrangement with the Soviet Union in the Arab region based on a revolutionary program that had what people would have called at the time petty bourgeois ambitions. So, there was, in the 70s, you had all of this discussion on the part of the more radical Arab movements, especially in the auto critiques, saying, look, the small bourgeoisie elements that entered into the revolutionary struggle, they wanted agricultural reform and land reform. They wanted genuine sovereignty. Non-alignment is a core component of that. And they wanted a situation where there would be a bigger horizon for cooperation in the region and possibly even integration when it comes to the Arab nationalist side of it. So their demands were enhanced, of course, by an arrangement that would bring the Soviet Union into the picture, precisely because the US was opposed to these kind of visions globally, not just in this part of the world. However, some of their demands were not incompatible with certain US visions, because the number one and most important objective for the US in this region at the time was Gulf oil. And that meant that what you needed was a stabilization program. And if that meant dealing with some of the social questions that were posed by radical movements, there could have been arrangements reached by empire. I'm not promoting the line here, by the way, that revolutionary movements should have cooperated with the empire, and they didn't want to, and they shouldn't have. because at the end of the day, the U.S. has been an enemy of progress in this part of the world and revolution in its official policies, not, of course, the U.S. people necessarily. But when it comes to the question of Israel and Zionism, there was always a different logic in operation, and that was very ideological.
That question about Kissinger really leads into the broader question of what motivated such overwhelming U.S. support for Israel. It's a really classic question that continues to divide people on the left. Was and is Israel important to the U.S. because it's an instrument of U.S. power in the region, or was and is it that the Israel lobby causes the U.S. to so strongly support Israel beyond what is, quote unquote, objectively strategic for the U.S.? I say quote unquote because obviously objective strategic interests are contingent and constructed. But zooming out, what more broadly does create this relationship, and are there changes that we should be noting historically in the U.S. approach to Israel and to the Palestinian question from between, say, 1948 and where we are now in this history, the 1970s?
I mean, what is striking, Daniel, in left discussions at the moment on this is, first of all, their lack of engagement with serious history. They're based on, positions that are already pre-formulated and prefabricated. And also, what I find striking about them is their actually lack of serious Marxism. Because, and by Marxism, I mean the way Marx used to treat things. So Marx, when he was dealing with political questions, of course, including geopolitical questions, he was accounting for the way the social interests and the political interests interact in any given space. Okay, and he had very nuanced approaches to that. We see very little of that when it comes to analysis of this question. It's either a very vulgar economistic understanding of imperialism in the region. So Israel is needed because, the oil. Well, I mean, any scholar of the Gulf that really checks the documents on the Gulf will know that, or has a basic understanding of how Gulf oil was controlled, will tell you that there was no need whatsoever for Israel when the U.S. set up its Saudi operations in the 1930s, or when Britain was setting up its entire regional system. That predates even the Zionist project when it comes to the British arrangement around this. They already had a security formula for the Gulf. And the main problem for them in the Gulf was actually Iran and Iraq, and in the case of the Gulf state, the smaller Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. So these security discussions, are not based or rooted in reality. What we do find, however, is that the Israeli presence caused destabilization for the Gulf states. So it was seen as a liability from their perspective, not as an asset. Those that promote, however, this line, including, by the way, people in the Arab world, think that this was a question of dividing the region. So by transplanting this entity in the region, a settler colony, you're gonna divert energies from liberation and cause division. I think that's not a good way of understanding how imperialism works or makes decisions. I find no evidence whatsoever that the initial deliberations around the setting up of the settler colonial state or its later support were based on this logic specifically of we need to divide this region. And that's for a very simple reason, which is that they already had dominated the region. They didn't need, when they were setting up this project, the British had control over the Suez Canal. Sometimes people tell you, they needed to protect Suez. I'm like, they had control over Suez and they had control over Palestine militarily. They could have functioned turned it into a colony basically, or something along these lines. We talked about this a million times before. Now, when it comes to my own understanding, and I think where the left needs to upgrade its discussion, because also on the other side you have this lobby argument, which is equally problematic because that just views politics as detached from capital, detached from empire, detached from, and it assumes a certain, in some cases, it assumes even good intent on the part of imperialism. America was a well-intentioned state that got dragged into this by
who.
Yeah, and worse, and the worst versions of this lobby argument, there are serious anti-Semitic elements to it. Not all of it, by the way. So it's, there's very serious arguments made by people who promote the lobby line that are not anti-Semitic, but there's a right-wing version that is anti-Semitic. Now, the actual alternative, and I think it's the serious alternative, and it's the genuinely it's alternative that would apply genuine Marxist analysis, is to treat Zionism. And I've said this before, and I'm pretty much, I've been trying to promote this widely as much as I can, is to treat it as a genuine political and social movement, because it is. It has been operating in the U.S. scene in a very serious ways, and it has a very effective lobbying arm, but it also has deep social roots. There are mothers that work to create grassroots support for Israel. Today, even during this genocide, you have these mother groups on Facebook, for example, that are harassing school administrators, that are promoting genocide denial, unfortunately. There are student movements, now less so in our day and age, but in the old days, there used to be an active Zionist student movement. There is work in political parties. So all of this indicates the existence of not only an ideology, of course, of Zionism, which of course does exist, but also a social base for that ideology. And yes, that ideology is developed in relation to a faraway place, Palestine, but it's treated as a domestic concern by these people and by its promoters, by the promoters of this ideology, and by those that belong to the social and political movement around it. There is an element of capital. There is a capitalist story in this, which is, of course, that without the inequities in the global order, the serious economic inequities, it would not have been possible for European states and later on North American states to impose a settler colonial project on a region like that of the Middle East. There is an imperialist dimension, of course, but that form of imperialism is very much connected to a domestic movement as well. And we see this in other settler colonial cases, especially with settler colonial cases. There is a domestic dimension to the imperial question. Now, I would suggest that this is actually a more intense domestic dimension, because in this case, there's a stronger religious ideology around it. One section of this political and social movement is rooted in Christian Zionism. Another section is rooted in reformulations of Jewish theology. There's other sections that are rooted in the development of Jewish nationalism especially after the Second World War, but even before that. So all of this has to be taken into account when we want to seriously analyze Zionism and the way it works.
And it seems like there's, beyond these specific bases for Zionism as an American social movement, there's this more general ideological American commitment to Zionism that's obviously in a bit of crisis right now, but that comes to see Israel as so much like the U.S. that it's essentially an extension of the U.S. They are us. The October 7th attack is an attack almost on American soil.
Yes, and this, Daniel, there's a huge and massive literature, of course, on this, and we've had many studies discussing the cultural dimension, because of course there are similarities, but there are also differences. The similarities lie in the fact that this is a settler colonial state, the fact that there was religious imagery used in its conquest, including specifically relating to Palestine, like Canaan, the new Canaan, all of this. There's so many elements that you could draw upon to create a culture of support for the Israeli state in this country. But the point is that this offers the cultural register. But there has to be a mediating force that brings that register to the fore and acts on it. These are speech acts at the end of the day, Daniel, and they have to be made by someone. And the space where that gets made is the political space. And we have to treat it as such. This is a political battle, and it has to be dealt with as such. This is why I emphasize this. And now, a serious class analysis also has to now be applied to the constituent elements in which the original Zionist alliance was made, and which is now changing. Because what we're seeing now, and I think it's very clear to people, is if you apply serious class analysis now to, for example, American Jewish populations, you'll see that it's much more likely for middle-class Jews to be losing support for this project now. And we see this across the board. It's much more likely, and also if we apply a cultural analysis lens, it's much more likely for intellectual Jews to be losing support for this now. Amongst Christian circles, there were churches that also reformulated their ideology. But what we're seeing, though, is the big capital, of Christian dominations or within Jewish communities or elsewhere are hardening their support. Because this question has been repackaged now as a question of left and right. Increasingly, Palestine is seen as a commitment for the left, whereas supporting Israel is a commitment for the right.
And then to follow up, are there changes that we should be noting here in the U.S. approach to Israel, both in terms of concrete U.S. policy, but also in terms of the more general American ideological commitment to Israel and how Americans relate to the Palestinian question, how all of this changes over time between, say, 1948 and where we are now in this story, the 1970s?
Yes. So, of course, in 1948, the U.S. plays a big role in setting up the Israeli settler colonial state. And that was primarily through diplomatic pressure both on the states that were members of the UN, and later on, various forms of diplomatic pressure to ensure that state continues to be able to sustain itself globally after the war. On the military front, much of the armaments were flowing from Europe, and Western Europe in particular, in the early stages of the formation of the Israeli state. And of course, as we've discussed earlier, even the first major weapons shipment was from the Eastern Bloc during the 1948 war. Zionist militias are able to achieve victory in that war through a Czech arms deal. But we have a transformation happening where there is this primarily diplomatic and economic assistance given. It gets more and more intense as we enter the 60s. That said, we should not fall into the trap that is suggested by some scholars saying the relationship becomes only significant after the 67 war. Because in the 50s, for example, the U.S. designed entire regional policies around the Israeli question. Its relationships with Egypt, its relationships with other states in the region are shaped by that. And they're trying to pressure these states to accept the settler colonial presence in their midst and to normalize it and to resettle Palestinian refugees. So that is a major commitment on the part of the United States towards the Israeli state. Now, in the 60s, we have major transformations taking place, of course. Throughout the 40s and 50s, yes, you have supporters of Israel winning within the internal deliberations of the U.S. empire, but there are also dissenters. There were strong voices that did not see an Israel first policy as beneficial for imperial interests, and they were saying that within the State Department and elsewhere within the U.S. elite. You had all sorts of figures that were deeply involved in designing Middle East policy, were identified by the Zionist lobby as the Arabists within the State Department, for example. Those tended to be regional experts who wanted to pursue an imperial policy based on the realities prevailing in that regional sphere. They get sidelined increasingly. So the new innovation in the 1960s, and that starts really with the Kennedy years, but it gets much more intense under Johnson, is that in the domestic arena, the domestic foreign policy arena, the Israel lobby achieves major victories. And that's a significant dynamic that takes place, including, most importantly, the humiliation of Senator Fulbright and the failure of the Senate investigation committee that he had set up to look into the influence of Israeli lobbyists in Washington. So that's an important turning point. For those who are interested in these kind of dynamics, there's a new book by Ilan Pape, Lobbying on Both Sides of the Atlantic. And of course, Ilan is always a fantastic historian and a great anti-Zionist, towering figure within the Israeli scene. He's the best Israeli historian alive and a true visionary. In any case, the changes that happened after 1967 are huge, though, because the U.S. To begin with, it authorizes 1967, of course. Johnson does that. He gives the green light. He creates the conditions where such a thing is possible. And a war like this could not be conducted without the approval and support of one of the major superpowers. But then we end up with the victory in that war being used within Washington on the part of the political and social movement that we've referred to, that is Zionism and its lobbying arms, to make an argument within the national security establishment, saying Israel is the main U.S. asset here. It becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They become the main arm of U.S. military power in the region, even though they fought that war with a primarily French-supplied Air Force, etc. But now they get a more serious military commitment on the part of the U.S. In those years, and this military commitment is more than just turning a blind eye to them getting nuclear weapons, which of course was happening with French and British and to some extent U.S. support in those years, and South African, of course, support. It goes beyond that. By the post-1967 period, we enter into a new terrain where they're just arming them to the teeth. And they're providing much bigger aid. That increases after 1973 even more. And Kissinger plays a big role in this. He enshrines this idea that Israel always has to be better armed than the entire region combined. He enshrines this idea that Israel is the core of the Cold War policy in this part of the world. But at the same time, he's careful to present it in very shrewd terms. This is not somebody who will come out and tell you, well, I'm an ardent Zionist, therefore this has to happen. And of course, he is the author of several books. You will not find a trace of a declaration of his ideological commitment. What you will find is carefully crafted arguments that suggest that, for example, this is a conflict from time immemorial. Here's the Arab case, here's the Israeli case, here's the U.S. interest, but always the U.S. interests end up somehow propping up the Israelis, marginalizing the Palestinians, and essentially creating conditions where the Arab states exit any form of an orbit that is designed to support the Palestinian cause.
That was the 15th episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics, with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that is now back online. Check it out. There's a link in the show notes. It's really, really something. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabee. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please leave us a nice review. Those ratings and reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling people IRL or online, wherever, to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.